Hi, welcome to Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception. There is a quiz that follows this lecture, so be sure to pay attention. Also, as usual, I want to mention that I'm not covering all the topics that are covered in your textbook. I'm just going to highlight a few. So, two important concepts in psychology are sensation and perception. Now, they sound similar, but they actually describe two different parts of how we experience the world. Sensation is about how you receive the raw information from your environment. And this happens through your sensory organs, like your eyes, ears, skin, nose, tongue. And they detect things like sound, light, pressure. It's a biological process with our body picking up all these different signals. So for example, when light hits your eyes, your retina detects it, and that's called sensation. Perception, on the other hand, is how your brain interprets these sensations. It's a psychological process. So your mind makes sense of what you're sensing. Perception is it is shaped by your past experiences, your emotions, your expectations, and even your culture. For example, your eyes sense light and color, sensation, but your brain interprets it as a sunset or as a warning sign. So why does this matter in psychology? Well, understanding the difference helps us explore why two people can hear and or see the same thing and interpret it quite differently. And we'll actually talk about that in some later chapters also. But our mental health does affect our perception. For example, someone who has anxiety, and remember we talked about how anxiety, you have a heightened sense of awareness. Well, you might perceive a neutral face as threatening, or if you're anxious, you might perceive like a sound as something dangerous, whereas somebody who doesn't have anxiety might, not even think about it. So we're going to go into the basic senses, and then I'll give you just a little bit more information. So, and I'm sure you learned this probably in elementary school. In fact, I'm sure in elementary school, we have 5 senses, and that's our body's way of gathering information from the environment. This includes sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Each sense is linked to a specific organ, and it helps us interpret the world around us. For example, our eyes detect light and color, our ears hear sound and vibrations, and understanding how these senses work is key to understanding key to exploring perception, brain processing, and then also behavior in psychology. So let's start with your eyes. Rods and cones are the photoreceptor cells in your retina that make sight possible. So we'll start with the basics. Your retina is like a movie screen in the back of your eye where light gets projected. But to turn that light into something your brain can understand, you need photoreceptors, and that's where the rods and cones come in. Quick side note, the way I remember the difference between them, other than their shape, rods are longer, the cones are more cone-shaped. But cones start with the letter C. So cones are the receptors that detect color. So I just remember C, color, C, cones. And for rods, I always remember it. I just associate the word rod with hot rod, like a car. And for some reason, I have this vision of like hot rod racing at night. So your rods are responsible for your night vision. So that's just my way of remembering the difference. So going back to the rods, think of your rods night vision. They are super sensitive to light, which makes them perfect for seeing in dim or dark, but they don't detect color. Remember, cones, color, rods, night. So when you're in low light, everything looks kind of grayish because your rods are only detecting light, not color. Your rods also have more around the periphery of your eye, and that's why peripheral vision works better in the dark. Cones are your color and detail experts. They work best in bright light and they allow you to see sharp images and bright, vibrant colors. There's 3 different types of cones and they're sensitive to different wavelengths. So you have cones that specialize in red, green, and blue, and together they help you see the full spectrum of color. Your textbook also goes into more details about this, but that's just the basics there. So let's talk about your ear and hearing. So hearing starts with sound waves, and those are vibrations in the air, and they enter your outer ear, travel down your ear canal, and hit your eardrum. So in your middle ear, the eardrum vibrates, and there's 3 tiny bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and they amplify the sound. Inner ear vibrations reach the cochlea, and that sort of looks like a snail that's spirally in blue on the diagram here, and that is filled with hair cells. And they are critical, and we're going to talk about those in the next slide, but they're critical to convert vibrations into electrical signals. Your auditory nerve, these signals then travel up the auditory nerve to the brain, specifically in the auditory cortex, which is in your temporal lobe, that's here on the side of your head, and that's where we perceive sound. So why do we lose hearing as we get older? And I have to say this is something I'm a little bit interested in because my hearing is not as good as it used to be, which was not helped by me wearing a Walkman through the 80s, blaring, anyhow. So as people grow older, they can experience what we call presbycusis. And presbycusis is a reduction in the ability to hear. This happens because those tiny hair cells, the cilia, in your cochlea, the ones that are responsible for detecting sound and vibrations, they begin to degenerate or die over time. And the cells don't regenerate, so once they're damaged, hearing ability is permanently affected. Presbycusis usually affects the ability to hear high frequency sounds first, and I can tell you I'm right there. My kids will hear something and I don't hear it. And that's why older adults might struggle to hear things like a bird with a high chirp, or even understanding speech clearly in noisy environments. Other conditions that affect our hearing, there can be changes in the auditory nerve, which can slow down how the sound signals are processed. There can be stiffening in the structures of the middle ear, which can reduce the sound transmission. And then, as I did, there could be cumulative exposure to loud noises over a lifetime, and that can accelerate damage. So in short, age-related hearing loss is mostly due to wear and tear of the inner ear, especially the cochlea hair cells. And it's just a normal part of the hearing or of the aging process. So let's talk a little bit about absolute threshold, which is a key concept in sensory psychology. Absolute threshold is defined as the smallest amount of stimulation that a person can detect half of the time, or 50% of the time. So it's the smallest amount of stimulation that you can detect. In other words, it's like the bare minimum level of a stimulus that you can reliably notice. So here's a few examples. Hearing the tick of a watch 20 feet away in a quiet room. Seeing a candle flame from miles away. A drop of perfume. How much perfume do you need to have for somebody to notice it in a large room? So these are just examples of how sensitive our senses can be, but keep in mind they vary depending on the person, the environment, or even the time of day. So why do we care about this? Well, in clinical psychology, detecting hearing impairments, for example, is important. And if you've ever had a hearing test, they'll play sounds. And what they're looking for is the absolute threshold. Like, when can you hear? And you raise your hand when you can hear the sound. So, I mean, it's important to be able to do that. It's also important with when we consider human factors in psychology. So, how do we design environments or tools or technologies that match human sensory limits? Um, I can tell you that different people are more sensitive or less sensitive. So, for example, my daughter, who's on the spectrum, her hearing is amazing. Like, her absolute threshold to detect something, um, it's like she's on hyper alert with sounds. But then think about that. I go into a room, I don't even hear it. I'm not registering. She is. So all that input is coming in, more intensely for her. So absolute threshold can also change depending on your mental state. So if you are anxious or hyper alert, you can detect weaker stimulus more easily. And that makes sense. Our body is ready for, a lion to come attack us. So we're on heightened alert. So if you are somebody who tends to be more anxious, um, it's likely that your absolute threshold is slightly lower, meaning that you can detect things earlier than I could. So this just shows how psychological factors can influence basic sensory processes. The other thing is the absolute or the difference threshold. So the difference threshold is the minimum amount of change that you need to detect that there is a change. So if I lift up dumbbells and I lift up a 10-pound and a 20-pound, absolutely I can tell the difference. But if I lift up a 10-pound, like 10-pound, 2-ounce, I can't tell the difference. 10-pound, 4-ounce, 10-pound, 6-ounce. I mean, you go to the point. So the difference threshold is the minimum amount of difference that you need to detect that something's changed. The absolute threshold is, the threshold when you can detect the stimulus at all. So this is the last concept I'm going to cover for this chapter. Be sure to read the entire chapter, but here we go. So I want to talk a little bit about bottom-up processing and top-down processing. And these two theories help explain how we interpret the world and why sometimes people see the exact same thing, but they remember it in very different ways. So let's start with the bottom-up processing. And this is when perception starts with just raw sensory input. Your brain builds understanding from the data it receives through your senses. It's data-driven. So you rely on what's actually there. For example, you see a new object and you figure out what it is based on its shape, its color, its texture. Top-down processing, and the way I remember this is I think top your brain, and as soon as your brain gets involved, that's when we're going to see differences. So top-down processing is when your brain uses prior knowledge, expectations, experiences to interpret sensory input. It's concept driven. So you rely not only on what you're seeing, but you also have your expectations and your beliefs. So let's say that two people are driving and both witness, and actually this is a true story, you witness somebody suddenly swerving in front of you. And later you might talk about what happened. And one person, say it's my husband, for example, would say that that person was reckless or aggressive, or they might even be angry during the driving experience because somebody cut in front of them. Whereas the other person, which hypothetically could be me, tends to immediately interpret it that maybe it's a new driver, maybe it's somebody who doesn't know how to get home and they swerve because they're like, oh my goodness, I'm not in the right lane. So what's the difference? Well, the top-down processing impacts our perception, and based on our past experiences, our emotions, the context, we don't just see what's in front of us. So if one person, again, hypothetically, my husband has experience with aggressive drivers, he could interpret that event as intentional and hostile and think that the person's a jerk. And I'm censoring the language right now. The other person, who tends to be more empathetic and cautious, interprets the same behavior as situational. I immediately think that's a brand new driver or an elderly driver or somebody who's just lost. So even though the sensory input was the same, the car cut us off, our brains filled in the meaning differently. And that's top-down processing. So side note, and this is something we're going to talk a little bit about later, but positive psychology. So positive psychology says that how we interpret events, even small ones like being cut off in traffic, can impact our mood, our stress levels, and our overall happiness. So if you interpret a driver as a reckless jerk, you probably will feel angry and stressed. But if you assume that they're a new driver, or maybe they're having a rough day, or maybe they have to get to the hospital for some reason, you just give them the benefit of the doubt. Everyone, you just give them the benefit of the doubt. You're more likely to stay calm. And that impacts your overall stress levels. And remember, we talked about cortisol levels. And that impacts your sleep, your weight. It's all tied together. So this sort of reframing process is a skill in positive psychology that we encourage people to use to help build resilience, emotional regulation, and just your overall well-being. That doesn't mean giving everybody a free pass, but as little things come at you, if you can interpret it, giving somebody the benefit of doubt, it does affect your overall sense of well-being. So that is it for this chapter. Be sure to read the rest of it. There is a quiz associated with this lecture, and let me know if you have any questions.